nothing will change. If nothing changed after Sandy Hook, when we watched these innocent little kids slaughtered with weapons of war, then nothing's going to change today. I have no doubt that things are going to continue status quo, right? Politicians will offer thoughts and prayers. There'll be another attack, rinse and repeat, and we'll go on. And the discussion will be about everything but guns. It'll be about mental illness and social media algorithms and all of these other things. But we won't talk about the common denominator in all these attacks. Look, the United States isn't the only country in the world with racists, but we're the only country that frequently suffers these types of attacks because we allow people to get their hands on high-tech, sophisticated weaponry. It doesn't happen in other countries. So why are we the only developed country or industrialized country that allows this to happen? It's our culture. We're sick, Dana. We're a sick people, and this is the outcome.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis in London. A lot going on. NATO, with Finland and Sweden. Coming up, a discussion with Henri Vanhanen, who is the foreign policy advisor for the main opposition party in Finland. Talk of a ceasefire or frozen war in Ukraine, and the hazards of pushing Ukraine to accept Russia's terms. Some stark warnings this week from the Center for European Policy Analysis and Nicolas Tenzer in Paris. But first, it's 19 weeks into the year, and America has seen more than 200 mass shootings. That's a shooting where more than 4 people die, including the attacker. There were at least 12 mass shootings across the U.S. just this past weekend. In Buffalo, 10 were killed and 3 injured in a grocery store. Investigators believe the 18-year-old arrested for the mass shooting became radicalized as a white supremacist after he got bored during the pandemic and immersed himself in online chat rooms full of memes and infographics saying the white race was being pushed aside by minorities. The suspect allegedly posted a 180-page manifesto prior to his killing spree that refers to the Great Replacement theory, the idea that white people are being supplanted by Jews and people of color. Right now, we talk to the Soufan Group, a think tank in America. All right, joining me now is Colin Clarke from the Soufan Group, and we've talked to Colin many times. Welcome, Colin. We normally talk to you about terrorism. And you are classifying this incident in exactly those terms. Can you tell me why?
Sure. I don't think this isn't even a border case. This is a clear-cut case in my mind of terrorism, of ideologically motivated political violence. This was a racist terrorist attack against African Americans in the city of Buffalo, and the alleged assailant makes no bones about that in his own online manifesto of exactly what he thinks of African Americans and had sought to do. And so I don't think there's any question here. There seems to be some mental illness at play, but that doesn't mean that it obviates the fact that this was a racially motivated violent extremist committing a terrorist attack.
The moment you say there may be some mental health issues, then those who would argue that this does not fit a larger pattern and that this is a lone wolf attacker will use that and say this is not about what you called a far right ecosystem that's gone mainstream.
Well, I would push back against that because I would say, one, the whole term lone wolf has been misconstrued and taken out of context. Even if this individual did act alone, he emerged from a broader far right ecosystem of racist rhetoric and the Great Replacement theory, which is, not only found on the dark corners of the internet, but on Fox News, on Tucker Carlson. The other part about what you mentioned is, no, this actually does fit a pattern. It does fit a trend. And this individual deliberately mimicked and copied the actions of other far-right extremists, including Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, including an attacker in Halle, Germany, including Patrick Crusius, the El Paso Walmart attacker. He even copied, writing racist terms on his weapon. He decided to live stream the attack on Twitch. So he took hallmarks and he actually called, he gave a shout out to these people in his manifesto. He studied them and he emulated them. So this is a pattern. This is a trend. And unfortunately, it's not going to be the last one. I think we all know that.
You mentioned Tucker Carlson. That is mainstream Fox News media. I mean, you can call it mainstream if you want. It's not a social media channel, not yet anyway. But Tucker Carlson talks about replacement theory as a kind of left wing. Maybe you want to characterize this, but he seems to characterize it as, a left wing attempt to silence the majority all the time.
Yeah, he's viewing this as a deliberate attempt on the part of Democrats to bring in immigrants into the country that I guess he assumes will almost always in lockstep vote Democrat, and that this is a subversive attempt to replace white people in this country. The other part of that that people often talk about, and that the killer talked about in his manifesto, was that this whole thing is being controlled by Jews, this cabal of shadowy Jews and financiers. This is the other boogeyman of the far right, the George Soroses of the world, whose hand they see behind everything. But we shouldn't sit here.
Okay, but we understand that those are his bent views.
Yeah, but they're reaching tens of millions of people on a daily basis, and so we can't sit here and act surprised when someone acts on them, and we say, "Wow, I can't believe it." Of course, why can't you believe that someone acted on the things that they're being told and harangued about on a constant basis? This is the inevitable conclusion.
How do you shut this down? The explosion. Well, first of all, okay, we've talked about cable TV. Nobody's going to shut Fox down, and Tucker Carlson gets great ratings out of all this stuff. But in terms of social media, is there an answer there? And then we'll talk about weapons after that.
Well, I think, there's organizations out there like the GIFCT, which is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. There's really smart, dedicated people there that understand this problem and that are doing everything they can. But we also need lawmakers to have a better understanding of the way that Silicon Valley works. It's farcical when you have these hearings before Congress and you have, octogenarian congressmen and women asking Silicon Valley CEOs questions that belies the fact that these people probably don't even use email, much less understand the way that Twitter, Facebook, they talk about algorithms like they're some kind of magic formula. So I think, having our own politicians get a better sense of what actually happens in these Silicon Valley firms is a good first step. Really, what they've been concerned about heretofore is donations to their own campaigns. And this has been, couched under the First Amendment and free speech, but it's run amok in many ways.
Tucker Carlson had nearly 400 episodes.
There you go.
400 episodes of Democrats trying to bring in more obedient voters from third world countries. So, and then that is then echoed. I'm not saying it begins there, but that is then echoed through social media. And you have people like this guy who carried out the attack in Buffalo, sitting there for the last 2 to 3 years in the pandemic, eating this kind of disinformation,
marinating in hateful rhetoric and,
high on hatred, some people have said.
No doubt.
So when you look at how many attacks there are, right? 19 weeks into the year, America has already seen 201, depending on the day, mass shootings.
That's insane.
There were at least 12 mass shootings across the U.S. this weekend, and they classify mass shootings as, I think, any more than 4 victims. I mean, it's
not normal. It's not normal. It's not a normal way to live.
So do you think now that we're crossing a threshold where lawmakers? No, you're shaking your head, anticipating my question. You don't think that we're crossing a threshold where America's going to deal with this?
Nothing will change. If nothing changed after Sandy Hook, when we watched these innocent little kids slaughtered with weapons of war, then nothing's going to change today. I have no doubt that things are going to continue status quo, right? Politicians will offer thoughts and prayers. there'll be another attack, rinse and repeat, and we'll go on. And the discussion will be about everything but guns. It'll be about mental illness and social media algorithms and all of these other things. But we won't talk about the common denominator in all these attacks. Look, the United States isn't the only country in the world with racists, but we're the only country that frequently suffers these types of attacks because we allow people to get their hands on high-tech, sophisticated weaponry. It doesn't happen in other countries. So why are we the only developed country or industrialized country that allows this to happen? It's our culture. We're sick, Dana. We're a sick people, and this is the outcome.
Do you worry that the connections between extremist groups, and I think you and I have talked about it in the past, in Europe and the US, I mean, there are some not tenuous ties, there are some very firm ties. If this is spreading more,
it is.
And it's getting worse, then I assume in Europe we should brace too for not exactly the same fallout, but similar attacks. And there have been some in the past.
Unquestionably. Look, there's an Anders Breivik or, Brenton Tarrant lurking, in the woodworks as we speak, unfortunately. We know that we've been lucky several times. We've been saved by terrorist ineptitude, but there's no shortage of people that have these ideas, including in some cases, there's been a lot of reporting on within Germany in the law enforcement community, in the military and the intelligence services that you have far-right extremist sympathizers. I think there's going to be a couple of different factors that lead this to be a big deal in Europe. One is, like all over the world, we're coming out of the pandemic finally. So these people that have been spending the last 2.5 years online imbibing racist rhetoric are now going to be out there in the world looking to do something. The second part is related to Ukraine. And I think, the Russian government, which has played footsie with groups like the Russian Imperial Movement, the Wagner Group, other kind of far-right extremist groups, they may very well seek to stoke the flames in Europe, not only at the political level, but through using some far-right, or white supremacist networks to cause trouble there. That's something I'm worried about also.
Last question to you. You are entering political season. You have the midterms, and then 2026 is not very far away. 2024. Getting mixed up with the Russian election in 2026 because you mentioned Russia.
A lot of similarities.
You're not very far from presidential race. The Republicans, especially, seem to get traction politically by pushing some of these theories and the idea that there is a cabal of Democrats that are controlling immigration for their political ends, and that people have to fight back. Are you worried that, if anything, we're about to see an increase in this kind of divisive, inflammatory hatred in terms of rhetoric?
I'm worried about that. I think it's happening already. But I also say I think it's incumbent upon the Democrats to talk about immigration too. To push back and to talk about it, because there is an issue at the border, right? This isn't just being totally fabricated. So, but what are we going to do about it? What is the immigration policy that makes sense, that's humane, but that also, explain to the American people what's happening, and don't cede ground to, disinformation and bullshit artists, excuse my French, that are out there trying to essentially manipulate voters, right? So I think the president needs to lead. He needs to be more vocal, whether it's the president or the vice president, and explain to Americans what's happening and why.
Colin Clarke for the Soufan Group. Colin, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Nicolas Tenzer is a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and he joins us from Paris. Hello, Mr. Tenzer.
Hi, hello. How are you doing? Nice to meet you.
Look, I know you've written a lot for CIPA, and then you also have a blog on Substack. What is that called?
Tenzer Strategics.
Tenzer Strategics. Okay. So, look, your article and your position is very interesting to me, because a lot of people are talking now about a ceasefire in Ukraine. It sounds almost counterintuitive to be saying there should not be a ceasefire, but I think that's exactly your position.
Exactly, because a ceasefire right now would be a win for Putin, basically, because the ceasefire would mean that we allow Putin to maintain his grips on Donbas regions and Crimea. And on the other hand, we have all the European Union leaders, as well as President Biden, saying that, well, we must abide by the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in its territories. And that will be completely contradictory, I think, in itself, because I think that our main goal, if we are serious on these principles, is basically to expel the Russian troops from the Ukrainian soil. So a ceasefire, in fact, at the end of the day, would mean that we recognize Putin's grip on Ukraine. And it will also have devastating consequences, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, for two reasons mainly. First of all, it would mean more Ukrainian civilians killed by Russia, because we perfectly know that in already Donbas occupied regions, there were a lot of tortures, forced disappearances, people killed in the streets, full-fledged repressions on any dissenting voice. And also for Europe, it would mean that we allow a kind of destabilization area at the very heart of Europe. And that would mean that we are not serious on the very principles of, the principles, for instance, of zones of influence. Basically, the principle of zone of influence is not acceptable because of the UN Charter, because of the Declaration of Paris in 1990, and it will contradict, the very words that the world main powers have established after the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War.
Okay, nowhere is the call for a ceasefire louder than perhaps where you are. And that comes from French President Macron. But he is not the only one, right? I mean, there are others that have called for ceasefire. The Prime Minister of Italy and others. Is the echo for calling this off and trying to talk both parties into a ceasefire, any kind of a ceasefire, getting louder?
Well, I think that basically the positions of both French presidents or Prime Minister Draghi and also German Chancellor Scholz are very ambiguous. I mean, they are not exactly calling for a ceasefire that could be detrimental to Ukraine. And you had a lot of talks, especially between President Macron, President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying that we support Ukraine, we are delivering a weapon to Ukraine, and so that doesn't mean basically ceasefire. And right now, basically, all the president of France and the chancellor and prime minister of Italy are saying explicitly that they are supporting Ukraine, even if they are not stating explicitly that they are ready to fight for Ukraine and fight for the freedom of Ukraine, which means the liberations of Ukraine's territory from Russian occupation. So it remains, a kind of, at the same time, as Macron coined it during his campaign in 2017, a kind of at the same time position. On the one hand, we are seeking for a kind of agreement, but they now recognize that this kind of agreement is very unlikely given the very fearful Russian position, but on the same time, trying also to find a kind of agreement. And in my view, I think...
In finding that kind of agreement, a lot of people have accused Macron of taking the position that he wants to help President Putin of Russia save face. Now, that was denied by Elysee Palace, but President Zelensky of Ukraine said that's exactly what Macron is trying to do. And what is the point of giving Putin an off-ramp at this point? What is the point of allowing Putin to save face diplomatically when he has invaded another country? And the only lesson he should be taught, a lot of people think, is one of defeat and be pushed back to pre-2014 lines.
Well, I think that's utter nonsense, basically, because a face-saving solution with a dictator that who has killed, hundreds of thousands of people I mean, mostly, in Syria, but also in Ukraine, but also in Chechnya, since 22 years. Basically, we have to remember that Putin has won all his wars since 22 years. I think that's a complete nonsense, because if we consider that the crimes against humanity and war crimes really matter, to have a face-saving solution with this kind of dictator, criminal dictator actually, has absolutely no sense. I mean, the only one thing that we have to do is to fully, radically defeat Putin. I mean, that's maybe a very clear goal. Of course, we can consider, the long terms, and you have the Elysee palaces, of course, stressing the point that, of course, in the long terms, we certainly will have to find with Russia a kind of new architecture of security. We have to go into more talks about, for instance, nuclear deterrence, the balance of forces in Europe, and this kind of things. That's basically certainly in the long run. But with Putin's regime, it's completely impossible. And I think that we have to make the distinction clear between Russia itself as a country and the people of Russia and the regime itself. I mean, Russia, and that's also something that was, emphasized by, the French philosopher and essayist Raymond Aron 60 years ago. It was a Soviet period, saying basically the politics of the Soviet regime is not the position of Russia itself. The regimes has an importance. And I think too often you have President Macron or Chancellor Scholz or many others talking about Russia as a kind of, let's say, abstract entity. And I think Russia is not an abstract entity. We have basically to face the threats posed by the Russian regime right now. So a kind of a FRAM solution or face-saving solution with Mr. Putin has absolutely no sense.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, and when I write, and I'm sure when you write, you were careful to say the Russian army or the Russian leadership, but I don't write Russians, because that's just too broad a brush. When a lot of Russians didn't want this war, didn't know there was going to be a war, and in fact, the Russian regime continued to deny it right up until launch date on February the 24th. So a lot of Russians that are living here in London, for instance, and probably in Paris where you are and the south of France, are walking around in shock that Putin did this.
Absolutely. And I will additionally say something, that I have a lot of talks with the Russian dissidents. Many of them are friends. Some are now imprisoned right now in Russia for saying the truth to the power. And all those dissidents in Russia always told me, please do not yield, do not offer any kind of concessions to Putin's regime. I mean, that's the Russians. That's not the Ukrainians. That's not the French. That's not the Baltic states. But the Russians themselves, who wants the freedom, considers that any kind of negotiations, compromise with Putin regime will basically weaken and undermine their own fight.
I'm curious why you think that suddenly there has been a flurry of discussion about a ceasefire. Just when Ukraine seems to be getting a little bit of momentum and taking some ground and counterattacking, is it because there has also been analysis that this war is not going to be over in a few months, that it could drag on for months and possibly, well into next year and beyond. And that's why leaders in Europe who are paying economically, as people of Europe are starting to say, wait a minute, this cannot go on that long, considering what it's going to do to fuel prices and food prices and all of the problems that we have with inflation and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think that's probably one of the reasons why they are taking these positions. But also, I think that most of those people basically do not understand Ukraine. They do not know Ukraine. They are very misinformed with what happened, in Ukraine right now. Well, I went to Ukraine, more than 20 times. I know Ukraine quite well. I was in Ukraine just 3 weeks ago again. To meet the people, the mayor of Lviv, the mayor of Kyiv, the mayor of Bucha, the martyred city, the mayor of Borodyanka as well. And I talk with those people, and those people, they are never complaining. Of course, they expect more for us, and rightly so. but they are basically have the vision of the future of Ukraine. And I think that sometimes the people in France or in Germany and in other European countries do not understand basically the willingness and also the preparedness of Ukrainian peoples. The state is working well. The local authorities are absolutely not dysfunctional. Basically, you have people ready right now, certainly to join the European club. Of course, we know that it would take probably 4, 5, or 7 years, but certainly not decades, as President Macron said, in a speech very recently in Strasbourg. They do not understand Ukraine, and I think that's why they are not very confident. The second thing is that it must be very clear for the European leaders and US leaders that we should do more, and that we should help Ukraine to win the war, not, in 2 years, 3 years, but in 3 months or 6 months.
But a lot of people say you're correct, that this cannot be won over years, that the assistance to Ukraine has to be so muscular that they are able to win this war within months. It cannot go on forever.
Absolutely. And I think that's very important. That's absolutely decisive. I think we can do that. So we should. Because, if we have a kind of frozen conflict, in Ukraine for 1 year, 2 or 3 years, it will be a disaster. First of all, a disaster for the Ukrainian peoples, because it will mean thousands of civilians dying because of the attack of Russian forces. It will mean forced disappearances in the Donbas territory, in Crimea. But also for Europe, it will be a disaster, because then it will certainly slow down the perspective of Ukraine to join the EU, because we will have a lot of European countries. Well, we cannot allow a country at war to join the European club, for instance. And it will have, of course, huge consequences and dramatic consequences for the Ukrainian economy and for the cohesiveness also, which is a point that is not often pointed out, the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian society itself. Because then there will be probably a lack of confidence coming on, and then it will be a disaster for Europe as well. Because I think that Ukraine is a true asset for Europe in both military terms and economic terms. And just imagine the perspective that we have this kind of frozen conflicts. It means the conflict going on, even with a lower intensity, maybe. Then it will certainly encourage Mr. Putin certainly to continue his aggressions to other countries, in Europe. And so I think, just imagine the contrary. Just imagine that we are very serious about, Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. If then Putin basically loses the war, it will have also a kind of very virtuous spiraling effect, in Europe, for very clear reasons. Because you have a lot of countries, let's take, for instance, Serbia, let's take also some African countries, some other countries, in Central Asia, basically appreciating the kind of prestige of Russia, right now, because of all the wars that Putin has won. If Putin loses, probably the attractiveness and the so-called soft power of Russia will certainly diminish dramatically. And that will be a win also in terms of security for Europe. That's another reason for which I think we have to support more Ukraine. It means very concretely deliver more weapons to Ukraine to win this war quickly, that many of us expect right now.
Nicolas Tenzer, great to talk to you, sir, from the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you, Nicolas.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Henri Vanhanen is the foreign policy advisor to the National Coalition Party in Finland, and he joins me now from Helsinki. Hi, Henri.
Hi, Dana. Nice to meet you.
So is it fair to say that even though you're in an opposition party right now, the issue of Finland joining NATO kind of bridges political differences, and that people in a vast majority in Finland want to become part of NATO?
Absolutely. I would say that if it wasn't a country or nationwide effort, this would not have been possible. See, I think the biggest driver behind this shift is obviously, of course, the people's will. Since after the Russian attack in February, the popular opinion jumped in just a matter of a couple of weeks in favor of 50% and above in favor of NATO membership. And a couple of weeks after that, and a couple of months as we proceeded, we have already now gone up to 76, I think is the latest number.
So, Henri, what has changed? I mean, why are the polls showing, this flood of support by Finns after Russia invaded Ukraine? Yes, the Kremlin has done something that the people of Finland don't agree with, but is Finland under threat? I mean, why do people feel that?
Well, I would say that there are two reasons. And the first one, of course, is that the atrocities and the terror done by the Russian soldiers and Russian troops against the Ukrainian citizens is one reason. People realize that we're now dealing with a quite ruthless regime next to us. So I think that made people think that we now need to maximize our security. But the second one is, of course, that one must remember that since 2004, Finland has utilized the so-called NATO option policy, meaning that it can seek to become a NATO membership if the security environment deteriorates dramatically. And one must also not forget that Finland has been a NATO partner since the 90s. So I think the parties and the people, they were always ready to become NATO members if necessary. So people were not needed to be sort of prepared for this in a short time moment. People were ready to make the shift if necessary.
I mean, people say that you're immediately an asset for NATO. I mean, some countries have joined and, probably the benefit has been to them rather than to NATO in some degrees, like, small countries like Montenegro and their very small military. But they say Sweden's military and Finland's military are very robust, well-trained, deployable on very short notice. I mean, what do you think that you bring to the party?
Well, I think we have to look at two things. Of course, the first one is geostrategic. Now, if you look at NATO's collective defense in Northern Europe and in the Baltic Sea region, you see that Finland and Sweden are located right between the Arctic and the Baltic Sea region. So therefore, in order to have an improved and more depth to NATO's collective defense in the region, you would definitely need the regions and the airspace and the maritime space of Finland and Sweden. For example, we've seen Sweden having joint exercises with the US troops and NATO troops where they give their airspace and naval space for Western and NATO troops in order to exercise the defense of the Baltics. So that's one example. And of course, if you look at, for example, Finland and the defense of Northern Norway and the Arctic, you see that Finland's strong army is actually very necessary and adds value. And then, of course, we talk about capabilities. Both countries have very state-of-the-art defense capabilities. For example, Finland just ordered 64 F-35s. It has the Hornet fleet. It has the Stinger missiles, the JASSM missiles. It has the GLMRS rocket launcher system. So we talk about very strong capabilities. Finland has a 280,000 wartime strength and a reserve up to 900,000. So I think this is something you have to...
Which is huge for a country of, what are you now, 4 million?
5.5, yes, exactly. So that gives NATO incentive to include Finland and Sweden into NATO. The fact that the both countries actually are security providers in the region, not security consumers. We are not a burden to anyone, whereas we actually add something to the table to NATO's collective defense.
How does your history play into this? I mean, Finland was invaded in 1939 by Soviet Russia.
I think it has left a mark in the Finnish collective historical memory, meaning that you verify first and then you trust in that order, vis-a-vis Russia, of course. It means that you have to take care of your national defense in all circumstances, especially the good ones, because, when the bad times comes around, you don't have the time to build up a credible defense and national security. And I think in the case of Finland, it's that we have tried to maintain a pragmatic and balanced relationship with Russia. But at the end of the day, if the Russian attitude towards the West as a whole is sour, then it really gives you no room to find dialogue or any common agenda.
I mean, some of the rhetoric is really important, right? Because for Russians, the denazification of Ukraine, the denazification of NATO countries and the Baltics, and everything is framed now in kind of World War II terms. It's all about Nazis, and Nazis are everywhere. And, we can understand how they sell that domestically. But on Russian TV this week, for instance, which is never a mild television program to watch, but they accuse Finland of being bastards who fought on the side of fascists. So what would you say about, I wouldn't normally even repeat something like that, but it does play to the rhetoric inside Russia of neo-Nazis and Nazis everywhere. And how dangerous do you think that is? Well,
one must remember that even though some of these things that the Russian state TV are now spinning and talking about, these well, they are completely false and really do damage to history. The purpose of them, of course, is to mold the ground, the domestic ground, into having images of enemies and sort of justify certain actions. And even though that they might seem ridiculous to us in our media, it doesn't go through in the Western media. We must remember that in Ukraine right now, Russia is fighting a very deadly war due to these lies and the same imaginary accusations. So they can be very dangerous. They can be used for different purposes, a number of reasons. But I think in the case of Finland and Russia, speaking about Finland, I think it refers to Finland fighting with the Germans, which of course is a undeniable historical fact. But that does not mean that Finns were fascists. We have to remember that it was actually the Soviet Union who attacked Finland first and forced Finland into a defense fight where it had to pick sides in order to survive. But that's of course another story. But it's just a reminder that the Russians usually tend to their role outside of those historical events and downplay their own significance when it comes to the events that have taken place.
Is this a dangerous moment? I mean, Turkey has said that it won't support the membership bid. Your prime minister and the president of Sweden are actually at the White House as you and I are doing this interview. And I think President Biden has suggested, any obstacles are minimal and they'll be overcome. But it is a dangerous moment in the sense that when you announce your bid to join NATO, you are not protected by NATO necessarily in this period.
Well, of course, first about Turkey. Now, before President Erdogan's statements that we heard, all the attitude, the reasons, the message that we got from Turkey were very positive towards Finland's NATO membership. It was only when Finland announced its desire formally that we started hearing these statements. And I think
is that is that about acquiring some extra F-16s or something, or President Erdogan simply using this as a bargaining chip in arms deals with America?
We were prepared that we could meet some obstacles, and these were to a certain degree expected that some countries might have a position that they would want to bring their own interests and concerns on the table, so to say. But I think it's true that at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to see a Turkey that is going to take down NATO's open door policy. That would not be that would not be in Turkey's interest, in NATO's interest. So I think we're going to go through a sort of diplomatic exercise with Turkey where we're going to see what we can do about Turkey's concerns. And at the end of the day, we will be able to get there on our side as well. So I don't have doubts on that. It will just take some time.
Last question to you, because I know you're busy. What is the most negative argument for not joining NATO, and how do you counter that?
Well, I think at the early weeks of the war, some concerns were about, could NATO's enlargement be an escalatory move, that bringing new border with Russia would be escalatory and cause new problems. But I think that as the weeks have gone by, we are starting to see that 2 weeks under these circumstances actually expire quite quickly, and the circumstances change. And we are starting to hear voices from the US and elsewhere in the West that they want to see Russia gaining not only immediate ramifications due to their actions, I'm talking about sanctions and the isolation, but also geopolitical and geostrategic costs, meaning that when Russia tries to reshape the European security by taking Belarus deeper into its sphere of influence and blocking Ukraine from entering NATO and the EU, I think you have a -2 scenario from a geopolitical perspective. Now, how do you balance that? You balance that with a +2 with Finland and Sweden entering NATO. And I think this is starting to be the positive outcome that also the West is starting to see. So what could have been seen as a negative and provocative thing is now seen as a good thing, actually. And something that
I guess how it ends in Ukraine is really important too. But will Finland, in this kind of discussion of not escalating tensions with Russia, try not to have permanent NATO bases in Finland? Also, things like missile defense, not staging missile defense close to the border.
Well, I think we're not that far yet when it comes to the actual discussion. But we also have to remember that Finland is going to, of course, utilize its membership fully, meaning that we're not going to limit our potential as a NATO member. That doesn't mean we will automatically bring this NATO infrastructure into Finnish territories. But I think a lot depends on Russia's behavior. If Russia behaves in an aggressive manner, then of course Finland will maximize its security. It's a natural cause and effect relationship. So if push is coming into a hard shoving, obviously Finns will have to reconsider its NATO infrastructure relationship as well.
Henri Vanhanen, Foreign Policy Advisor for the National Coalition Party in Finland. Henri, thanks so much. Great to finally be able to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
And that's our backstory this week, thanks to Colin, Clarke, Nicolas Tenzer, and Henri Vanhanen. I also do a newsletter on news I think you need to know, danalewis.substack.com. Check it out and share this podcast. Thanks for listening. I am Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.